Hello and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Ladi Akiriduluale, the headlines. Heavy artillery fire in Ukraine's Dnipropetrovsk region as the country says its counter-offensive will resume after the ground has unfrozen. Ukraine launches missile attacks on Russian-occupied Melitopol as explosions are also reported in Donetsk and Crimea. And Russian President Vladimir Putin says a peace deal on Ukraine will have to be reached one day in the future, but insists that potential partners have cheated in the past. A warm welcome to the program once again. A Ukrainian military official says heavy artillery fire, including Grad missiles, were reported in the region of Dnipropetrovsk overnight. Valentin Reznichenko, head of the regional military administration, says the communities of Nikopol and Mahanets were impacted and at least 30 shells were fired. He adds that there were no casualties reported so far. However, representatives of the state emergency services are inspecting the affected areas for more details. Meanwhile, Ukraine's defense minister Oleksiy Reznikov says Ukrainian forces will resume, quote, active counter-offensive actions when the ground unfreezes and becomes firmer for easier passage of equipment. Speaking at a press conference with his Swedish counterpart Paul Jansson in Odessa, Mr. Reznikov says, quote, the weather conditions, the transition from a dry autumn to a not yet freezing winter, we encountered rain and very difficult conditions for attacks from either side because the soil is wet and wheeled vehicles can hardly pass through. I think this decrease in activity is due to weather conditions. Mr. Reznikov also vows that the Ukrainian armed forces do not intend to stop. The defense minister called Ukraine's plan very simple. It is the liberation of all temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine as they were in 1991 when Ukraine's borders were internationally recognized. Mr. Reznikov said he believes Russians are, quote, fighting civilians in order to persuade the Ukrainian government to start negotiating on Russian terms, but they will not succeed in this endeavor. And multiple explosions have been reported in the Russian-occupied city of Melitopol in southern Ukraine, in the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic, and in annexed Crimea, including other Russian military barracks. The explosions in Melitopol come amidst reports from officials on both sides that Ukraine had launched a missile attack on the city, while Russian state media said 20 missiles hit the Donetsk People's Republic on Sunday morning. Separately, reports also emerged of multiple explosions in Russian-annexed Crimea, including at a military barracks in Sovietsky. Melitopol's Moscow-installed administrators said 4 missiles hit the city, killing 2 and injuring 10, while Melitopol's mayor reported several explosions, including at a church occupied by Russian forces. However, Ukrainian officials have not commented on the explosions in Crimea or in the Donetsk People's Republic. Russian President Vladimir Putin says Russia would likely have to reach agreements regarding Ukraine in the future, but felt betrayed by the breakdown of the Minsk agreements. Mr. Putin said Germany and France, which brokered ceasefire agreements in the Belarusian capital Minsk between Ukraine and Russian-backed separatists in eastern Ukraine in 2014 and 15, had betrayed Russia and were now pumping Ukraine with weapons. In an interview, former German Chancellor Angela Merkel said that the Minsk agreements had been an attempt to, quote, give Ukraine time to build up its defenses. Speaking at a news conference in Kyrgyzstan, Mr. Putin said he was, quote, disappointed by Mrs. Merkel's comments.
Honestly, I didn't expect to hear that from the former Federal Chancellor, Angela Merkel, because I always assumed that leadership of Germany behaved sincerely with us. Of course, they are on the Ukrainian side and support Ukraine. Everything that's being said now only goes to show that we did everything right concerning the beginning of the special military operation. Why? Because it turns out that no one wants to fulfill all these Minsk agreements. The meaning was only to pump Ukraine with weapons and prepare them for battle actions. We see apparently we focus too late, honestly. So it begs the question, how can we make deals? And can we make deals? And where are the guarantees? That is the question. Anyways, in the end, we have to make agreements. I've said many times that we are ready for these agreements. We are open.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says emergency crews were working to ease power shortages in many parts of Ukraine after Russian attacks, particularly in the Black Sea port of Odessa. Russian forces used Iranian-made drones to hit 2 energy plants in Odessa, knocking out power to about 1.5 million people, virtually all non-critical infrastructure in and around the port. Mr. Zelensky said Odessa was amongst the regions with the most frequent power outages. Other areas experiencing very difficult conditions with power supply included the capital Kiev and Kiev region, as well as 4 regions in western Ukraine and in the center of the country.
Restoration works continue in the south of our country. We are doing everything to return lights to Odessa. At this time, it has become possible to partially restore supplies in Odessa and other cities and districts in the region. We're doing everything to reach the maximum number possible in the conditions that developed after the Russian strikes. But now the Odessa region is still among the regions with the most frequent outages. The situations remain difficult in Kyiv and its region, Lviv region, Vinnytsia region, Ternopil city and its region, Chernihiv city and its region, Zakarpattia, Sumy region. We are constantly working with partners to make the situation easier and give our people more opportunities and more electricity. I spoke with President Macron today. It was quite a long conversation, more than an hour, and very meaningful. Defense, energy, economy, diplomacy. We are coordinating steps, preparing for the implementation of our peace formula. Mr. President Macron is supportive of it. And this is very important for us. Today I also spoke with the President of Turkey, Erdogan. As always, we had a very detailed conversation and about what is important, not only for Ukraine and Turkey, but what is truly of global importance.
Let's talk now to Professor of International Relations at the Lagos State University, Dapo Thomas, who joins us virtually. Good morning to you, Prof. Thank you for your time.
Good morning, Ladi.
Are you surprised that Mr. Putin is going back to the Minsk agreements? Several other people have made mention of this agreement and say that it was basically the foundation of the crisis that we face today, and that the failure of the West to abide by the provisions of the Minsk agreement in terms of enlargement of Western influence in Russia's backyard is what has led us to where we are today. Is Mr. Putin right in that, especially when he referenced it in this speech?
Well, to a very large extent, I think he's right, because there is what you call the spheres of influence. And Ukraine, being so close to Russia, should be seen as Russia's sphere of influence. However, this is an understanding. There is really no serious agreement. It's not sacrosanct. And as a result of that, in any case, even when you have a sphere of influence over a country, it does not particularly, it does not in any sense strategically neutralize the sovereignty of such nation. That nation is still at liberty to interface with any country or countries that it feels it can interact with, basically for economic purpose or for political purpose. And in this instance, if haven't weighed the options and haven't weighed the benefits. If the Ukrainians decide that, look, we prefer going with EU and NATO rather than staying with Russia, I don't think that agreement has anything. I don't think that agreement is detrimental, or I don't think Russia can use that excuse of sphere of influence to prevent Ukraine from achieving its sovereign interest, its own national interest. So a sphere of influence or spheres of influence does not and do not prevent you from carrying out your national assignments or from joining any nation or from joining any alliance or any organization which you feel will serve your interest better than the so-called protector of sphere of influence. So I believe in this instance, Putin seems to have gone too far in interpreting the concept of sphere of influence.
Given that scenario, of course, I know that when this conflict started, there were those who said that the sphere of influence Minsk agreement was, as you said, an understanding. It was not cast in stone. But that several countries before Ukraine, several countries in the sphere of influence had gone Western, the likes of Latvia, the likes of Poland, and all of that had moved, Estonia and Moldova and so on, had moved in the direction of the West. But that there was something about Ukraine that made Russia draw the line at Ukraine, that it was willing to allow all these others to go and do, as you said, in their sovereign best interests, but that Ukraine was a completely different matter. Now, we're in the 10th month of war, so I guess it also bears repeating that the Russians still believe that Ukraine is a different matter from all the others. Why do you think that is?
When you look at all those countries you have mentioned, I think it's more, Ukraine is more influential and more strategic to Russia when it comes to strategic importance. And again, when you come to the economic part of it, they see Ukraine as being more economically buoyant than the other nations. So the influence a nation wields within a geopolitical zone or a geopolitical influence, I mean, the influence a nation wields within a geopolitical zone counts a lot. So if Moldova, Latvia and co, all the Baltic nations, if they have decided to go with EU, and Ukraine also decided to go with EU, I don't think there is anything wrong, because except it is stated clearly that having, I mean, this sphere of influence concept covers absolute, I mean, provides or confers absolute control on Russia. Whatever Ukraine does. But in this instance, no, it has to be an understanding. And that's why I believe that the reaction of Putin in opting out, I mean, in preferring the war option is very, very unfortunate. Because at the end of the day, it has opened its lapses, its security lapses to the world. And don't forget, when this kind of scenario occurs, all the nations that are your enemies, all your enemies, would definitely be picking up certain intelligence report or intelligence lapses on your security. And this has happened. This has really opened Russia's lapses to the world, particularly to the United States. And don't forget, most of the intelligence info that Ukraine is acting upon are coming from the West, or basically from the United States. So that means Russia has exposed itself. So it shouldn't have opted for war with Ukraine, knowing that this is a very more influential ally, and discussion should have been taken. And in any case, it should have been satisfied with Crimea in 2014. You have already annexed Crimea, and yes, the Ukrainians may be planning integration or a reintegration of Crimea into Ukraine. But this would have been very difficult, because if Ukraine had been the aggressor on the basis that it wanted to retake Crimea, then I think the position of the West would have been different. But now Russia has put itself as the aggressor, and that is a very difficult position to take. And that's why you see this massive support from the West. And Ukraine, yes, may be the theater of war. Ukraine may be the guinea pig. Ukraine may be this and that, but it is obvious that the West is actually using Ukraine to test certain armaments and to test their power against Russia. So it's unfortunate that Putin took that position, took the war option, when there are other options. Definitely military option should be the last resort. It shouldn't be the first instance. And there is nothing on record to have shown that Russia had threatened, had discussed diplomatically, yes, let me put it that way, has discussed diplomatically with Putin or with the Ukrainian authority on the consequences of breaching the sphere of influence concept.
I can't let you go without asking your view about the grain deal, and not the general grain deal, but the one that is specifically targeted at Africa. The African continent has been mixed in its reaction to the war in Ukraine. Some of them have chosen to remain neutral. There are others who have said, well, look, Russia has had long-standing relations with us, so we're in a bit of a pickle. We can't choose Ukraine. And then there were others, fairly small in number, who picked on Ukraine. But now the Ukrainians have launched an offensive, a charm offensive, if you like, getting funds to take grain to poor African countries that would otherwise perhaps starve or have difficulty, shortages and all of that, as a way of enhancing its own support diplomatically on the continent. Do you think this is perhaps a little too late, or could they really have a chance of turning some minds in their direction?
Sorry?
I don't know if you heard me, Professor Thomas.
Okay, could they really do what?
I said, do you think that this grain deal, that it could change some African countries' minds towards Ukraine, that is, they will now become supporters of Ukraine? I mean, if they are beneficiaries of grain coming from Ukraine.
Well, I believe that the Ukrainian authority would have studied the situation, and they probably would have seen that they needed to do this in order to get the support of those. Don't get me wrong. Now, don't get it wrong. The support that Ukraine is targeting is definitely the support of the neutral, of those countries that are neutral for now, those who still talk of neutrality. So if they are in the majority, there is no way we can assess the percentage now. But let us take those who are neutral to be 40%, 50%. Then you take those who are for Russia, 30%, and those who are for Ukraine, 20%. So if you target the 50%, then it's something. And then out of the 50%, you are able to win this through this particular strategy or through this particular initiative. If you are able to slice off 30%, 35% out of the 50, it's something for them in Africa. It's something for them. So I believe that it's a strategic initiative by the Ukrainians, because now they are all, and it's very important. It's very important to always seek support, whether it is moral, whether it is political, for whatever reason it is for. Always make sure that you get the support of other nations, you know, because it can, even psychological influence, psychological support can also have its own impact. So they are going for the neutral states, African states, not necessarily those who have already positioned their policy, foreign policy towards Russia. So it's not necessarily, I mean, they are targeting those that are still neutral. So those who are for them don't even have any problem. They have the 20% or whatever percent that we can say is for Ukraine for now. So it's a very good initiative as far as I'm concerned. And I believe that for them to be taking this kind of trouble, efforts to want to satisfy some of these African countries, potential good signals for them to win the support of some of these African states you're talking about.
Indeed. Professor of International Relations, Dr. Thomas at the Lagos State University, thank you for your time and your perspective this morning. We thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me, Ladi.
And after the break, Britain says peace talks could be a cover for Russian rearmament. Details in a moment. Please stay. Welcome back. British Foreign Minister James Cleverly says any peace talks in Ukraine cannot be a fig leaf for Russian rearmament, adding that he had not seen any signs that Moscow would enter into negotiations in good faith. Mr. Cleverly said that while Britain wanted to see peace talks sooner rather than later, he reiterated that Ukraine should set the parameters for any negotiations that were held.
Need to be real, they need to be meaningful. They can't just be a fig leaf for Russian rearmament and further recruitment of soldiers, whether that be from the Wagner Group or trawling prisons in Russia. So of course we do want to see peace talks, but they need to be meaningful, and ultimately the content of those peace talks, the threshold that might be met in terms of bringing peace has got to be decided by the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian president. I'm not really seeing anything coming from the Russian side that gives me confidence that Vladimir Putin is entering these talks in good faith. The wider rhetoric is still very confrontational. But ultimately, as I say, we want to see this resolved. We would prefer to see it resolved sooner rather than later. I don't want to start setting the conditions for what Ukraine and the Ukrainian people should accept. Ultimately, it's their country that they're defending. It's their sons and daughters that have been lost. It's their homes, their infrastructure that has been damaged by Vladimir Putin's invasion. And it's up for them to decide the circumstances under which they'll be willing to negotiate for peace.
United States President Joe Biden and Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky spoke on Sunday to discuss Russia's invasion and recent U.S. efforts to strengthen Ukraine's air defenses. According to a statement published on the website of Ukraine's presidency, Mr. Zelensky thanked Mr. Biden for an additional $275 million in security assistance, which the Pentagon had announced on Friday, as well as for the wider and, quote, unprecedented U.S. support of Ukraine's sovereignty in the face of Russian aggression. The package announced last week includes weapons and artillery rounds, as well as equipment to help Ukraine boost its air defense. Meanwhile, the White House said in a statement that Mr. Biden reaffirmed the U.S. commitment to continue providing Ukraine with security, economic, and humanitarian assistance, holding Russia accountable for its war crimes and atrocities, and imposing costs on Russia for its aggression. Mr. Zelensky said the defense and financial assistance from the United States helped not only to succeed on the battlefield, but also to maintain the stability of his country's economy. He told the American leader that Russian missile terror has led to the destruction of about 50% of Ukraine's energy infrastructure, while thanking the U.S. for allocating aid specifically for the reconstruction of such infrastructure. Mr. Biden also highlighted the $53 million package announced late last month to support Ukraine's electrical system as it faces a barrage of attacks from Russia. And the United States policy on Ukraine may take a slight turn with the new leadership in the United States House of Representatives. That's according to House Speaker-elect Kevin McCarthy, whose party has a slim majority in the House, but is eager to make change. Our Washington correspondent, Maria Bird, has this report.
U.S. Republicans' major win of the U.S. House of Representatives means a divided government for the next 2 years of the Biden administration.
I'm proud to announce the era of one-party Democrat rule in Washington is over. We've got a close majority. We're going to have to work together. And we want to work with anyone that wants to make America stronger. We want to work with anybody on both sides of the aisle if they want to make America energy independent, give their parents a say in their kids' education, or secure our borders, or stop defunding the police. We know there's challenges in this nation around the world. We're listening to the American public. We are prepared to lead, regardless of the size of the majority.
The strong focus of the Republican agenda being on China and increasing the U.S.'s capacity to compete in the tech space may create a challenge for the Biden administration's Ukraine agenda.
We have not provided Ukraine with weapons that it is to use inside of Russia. We've been very clear that these are defensive supplies. The president said very clearly some time ago, we are not enabling Ukraine to strike beyond its borders. We are not encouraging Ukraine to strike beyond its borders. Everything we are doing, everything the world is doing to support Ukraine is in support of Ukraine's independence, its sovereignty, its territorial integrity.
The war against Ukraine is putting a toll on Russian resources. Talks to broker an agreement to end the war are on the table for Russian President Putin. But Russia says that the U.S.'s unwillingness to recognize Russian-seized territories from Ukraine makes peace talks difficult.
And with your permission, I'd also like to briefly address the shameless and transparent effort by Russia to annex parts of its neighbor Ukraine. The United States, I want to be very clear about this, the United States will never recognize Russia's claims on Ukraine's sovereign territory. The so-called referenda was a sham, an absolute sham. The results were manufactured in Moscow.
The new Republican House has indicated that they will be more tight-fisted about the amount of U.S. aid for Ukraine, but they are not expected to cut it off, despite all 57 House votes against a bill that provided more than $40 billion for Ukraine in May, coming from members of the party. From Washington, Maria Bird, Channel Television News.
The Ukrainian port of Odessa was not operating over the weekend after the latest Russian attack on the region's energy system. That's according to the Agriculture Minister, Mykola Solsky, who added that grain traders were not expected to suspend exports. Mr. Solsky said that Odessa port was not operating at the moment because the power generators had not been switched on yet. He adds that grain traders continued to ship grains via 2 other ports. Ukraine is among the world's largest producers and exporters of corn and wheat, but its exports have fallen significantly due to the Russian invasion. In the meantime, a bottleneck is building across an important trading route for oil, which, if left unresolved, could knock global supply and boost prices at a fragile moment for energy markets. According to a report from Istanbul-based Tribeca Shipping Company, 16 oil tankers traveling south from the Black Sea were waiting to cross the Bosphorus Straits into the Sea of Marmara. A further 9 tankers were waiting to cross southbound from the Sea of Marmara through the Dardanelles Strait into the Mediterranean. The snarl-up in waterways controlled by Turkey, which Turkish officials said is mostly affecting crude oil shipments destined for Europe, has caught the attention of the United Kingdom and U.S. government officials who are now in talks with Ankara to resolve the growing impasse. The snag is linked to a Western price cap on Russian oil that came into effect last Monday. The cap is supposed to limit the Kremlin's revenues without adding to stress on the global economy by reducing supply. But Turkey is insisting that vessels prove that they have insurance that will pay out in light of the new sanctions before allowing them to pass through the straits linking the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. All right, then, let's be joined by John McQuarrie of our business desk to talk a little bit about some of the happenings in business. Now, tell me, this topsy-turvy turns in energy prices. Now we're having oil tankers stuck. And there are those who are already thinking that perhaps there'll be a rise.
There is a rise this morning in oil prices, actually, and obviously it's not far away from what you just read, the issue of tankers being stuck, and Russia also threatening to cut supply following that price cap.
Right.
You know, so it's as you said, it's a topsy-turvy situation for oil prices, and uncertainty looms in energy supply for Europe, and well, even revenue for Russia, even though some people are saying, well, it might not really be hurting Russia as much as
it will be hurting those who are imposing.
Yes, exactly. You know, so the people who are imposing actually being victims of their own policy. And then, of course, we see the price of oil is also being affected by, I mean, I think a lot of things are just hitting oil at this time. There's been a pipeline leak, they call it Keystone Pipeline leak, that transports about 622,000 barrels a day of crude from Canada to the U.S.
Right.
That has been leaking since Wednesday, and they've not even been able to trace what caused the leak and how to stop it. You know, so that, of course, is another minus from the supply. So if Russia goes ahead to react to this price cap, and so we're cutting supply, that, of course, removes another chunk from it, and we might see price still going further. And to top that, we have China now easing the COVID rules. So that means demand is increasing.
Right.
So that's another hit on price, which may be good for a country like Nigeria on the one hand, but I mean, it's not good for the world, because we're still talking about how prices have increased,
that's right.
energy has increased, and of course that's fed into manufacturing and products at the end of the day.
Now, the way you've explained it now tends to give the impression that all of this, the price cap, Russia's refusals, and all of that, will be a subsidy to China.
Yes, well, that's what analysts are saying, because, so the price cap is at $60.
Right.
Even before the price cap, we've discussed how Russia sells at $50, $60.
Yes.
You know, I think I was discussing with Ladi off camera to say it looks like the EU was just trying to play it safe, putting it around $60.
So that the Russians, the Chinese can continue to get...
And guess what? Guess what? China has some very big refineries where they refine crude and sell to the world. So now China is going to feed on this. That's why analysts are saying this is like subsidy for China, because now there's no threat of secondary sanction. There's no sanction anywhere because, oh, you place it at 60, we buy it at 60, but they buy even more now, you know, and Russia cannot increase it to 70, so they sell it at most 60 for a country like China. China has Sinopec, Petrotech. These are big refineries, so they can buy this crude at 60, which is cheap, and then sell it and refine it and sell it to the world. China is making money. And guess what? Russia is also making money, because if China increases its demand, even at $60 a barrel, they are also still making a lot of revenue, billions of dollars. Right. You know, that's what they're still making.
Which is why those who were talking about the cap wanted it to go down to about $30 or $20.
Which we know will take a lot of guts.
And that was not going to happen.
So analysts are saying that if really the EU wants to win itself, and you know they're talking about price cap on gas,
right,
which is going to be even more different.
Which is a different
very different. If they really want to deal with the issue and win themselves off Russian fossil fuels, then the best thing would be to invest in alternatives, in clean energy. And they, in October, they arranged where they have a fund. They're going to take some money from there and then feed it. And they're having a meeting towards that. They're having a meeting towards that. They're going to get some money from the fund and then give it to countries. That's their individual countries
right.
to develop investment in alternative energy. And but I mean, while they are doing that, what's
going to happen to the rest of the world?
Mm-hmm.
That's a question that we'll of course wait for the answers. Ini, as always, a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
To break down some of this. And there'll be more, of course, right after this on Business Morning, and then later on Business Incorporated.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ini. Let's now talk to Maria Bird, our Washington correspondent. Our story on possible change in policy in Ukraine, on Ukraine, by the United States, given this newly divided Congress. Nice to see you, Maria. I know it's very early in the morning in the United States, but nice to see you once again.
Very good to see you as well.
Now, is it really going to be something significant in terms of a change of policy? I mean, we listened to Speaker-elect there, McCarthy, but he seemed to, at least on first glance, talk from both sides of the aisle, as it were. On one hand, saying it won't be business as usual, the era of one-party rule is over, and then on the other hand, saying because the majority is slim, they need to work together. Now, how can these two go together?
Well, I think that what he's trying to do is he's really trying to enforce kind of the Republican Party's is still very relevant in today's marketplace and in the U.S. And I think that's really what he's trying to do. He's trying to reestablish the Republican Party, which, as we know, has been divided in and of itself over the last 4 to 5 years, especially looking at what many consider the MAGA Republicans and those more traditionalist Republicans. And so I think that if you also listen to him, he talked about how he was a call to action and kind of they called to say we are the Republican Party for all people. So even in some way, we're recruiting individuals who might either be independent or who might be Democrats and maybe are maybe interested some way of the Republican Party. So in some way, it was a recruiting effort as well. And also to be clear that the Republican Party is one that is looking at all Americans and that will be meeting the benefits and will be hearing all American issues. And so I think that is where you're talking about, McCarthy's focal point and kind of seeming to be maybe having two varied opinions. But I think he's trying to make sure that he speaks to all people, unlike I think what many have viewed or their opinions of the Republican Party over the last 2 years, especially as we talk about what happened with the January 6 attacks.
Now, is that really, I mean, because this majority, as Mr. McCarthy referenced there, this majority is much slimmer than what most people expected from the midterm elections. As a matter of fact, before the elections, there were so many who were thinking that the Republicans would take both houses of Congress. That didn't happen. The Democrats made very, very significant, impressive inroads. They kept on to they've held on to the Senate with an increased majority. So is it really going to be possible for the Republicans to do what they say they want to do, particularly as it relates to Ukraine? Could they really, to some extent, slow the flow of funds?
That is, I think, what many Americans will be watching to see. Unfortunately, I think it's expected that we will see gridlock within the government. When you're talking about, as you said, a majority House Republicans and then a majority Senate Democrat and then an administration that's Democrat, we're going to be looking at a kind of tough 2 years, especially as we look to being able to move policies through. I think that that's why you hear him talking about all coming together, crossing the aisles, working together, because that is going to be necessary to move some things forward. Now, with the Ukraine policy, I think the president has put up quite a bit of a stronghold, and he has put the U.S. in a position where we have been a leader within the war against Russia. And so that is, I think, an area that will be a little difficult being able to slow down. The area that he can potentially, as he stated, a fist hold and kind of a tightening of the belt on the economic support, that could potentially be the case if it is going to be funds that are going to be coming out of the legislation. But the president will still have the ability to do an executive order and to still himself send funding there. So that, I think, is going to be a little bit more difficult to see. But they can begin to set some policy and some thoughts so that over the next 2 years, and as we all know, that there is conversation around ending the war, and so maybe in 2 years the war will be over. But if not, that will be a definite topic point of discussion as we look at what's going to happen in the 2024 election cycle for president.
I'm happy you brought that up, because when I have you on set like this, I would always, of course, want to talk about that and the other issues that perhaps Ukraine is either obscuring or preventing from taking the total limelight. And I'm happy you mentioned 2024. Coming from the midterms, the Democrats seem to have a momentum. And they do say that they're going to go after former President Donald Trump, who has indicated that he wants to be the Republican candidate for 2024. The January 6th committee in the House of Reps is talking about criminal referrals to the Justice Department before it winds up its work later on this month. Of course, President Trump, or former President Trump, has called that a political witch hunt. On the other hand, the Republicans want to investigate Hunter Biden and President Joe Biden as it relates to Ukraine. So that's not the issue of support for Ukraine is not the only subject that brings Ukraine into U.S. politics, is it?
No. You're exactly correct. I mean, this is not the only area. And I think, as you've said before, you said the 2024 elections, that is going to be, you mentioned Hunter Biden. I mean, there's so many areas where Ukraine has become a focal point within the U.S. Political landscape. And so as we look at 2024 and as we look to see where we're going to end up for the presidential candidacy, and as you said as well, former President Trump has said he is going to put his hat in the ring. The challenge that what we've seen is, as you said, there was a thought that we were going to have a much larger majority with House Republicans. And so we don't have that. It's a very slim majority. And we've also seen a large referendum against the Trump Republicans, what has been called the MAGA Party Republicans. There have not been as many that was anticipated that would have won during this midterm election, did not win. And so does that mean that former President Trump will have a viable option in 2024? We're anticipating that in January, February, we will be hearing from both the Democratic and the Republicans parties as to who they will be supporting. And it will not be a surprise if there is a Republican. As we already know, former Vice President Pence has potentially looked at running. We know that Ron DeSantis has looked at potentially running. And then we know former President Trump in that area. And so there are other candidates that potentially could be the Republicans' choice and who they begin to put their efforts behind and looking at for the run for the White House.
On a day-to-day basis, how are Americans feeling? I mean, if one takes the results of the midterms, it tended to suggest that the economy was on the mend, and which is why the Democrats didn't do as badly as some had anticipated they would do, given the economic conditions in the run-up to the midterms. What is it like on a day-to-day basis? The shortages that we talked about before now, during the last time I spoke to you, the immigration issues that came up with immigrants being bussed into Washington and other such cities in the usual gridlock attempt to blame one party or the other. And then gas prices, the price of commodities and all of that. What's it like now?
Well, what we're seeing right now is trying to really avoid a recession. I think that many Americans do believe that we are in a slight recession at this time. When we talk about still not being able to stabilize inflation, the stock market continues to be a great challenge. You can see a nice run of it going up, and then you'll see a run of great fall. And so I think the economy is still a #1 area of concern. We're also seeing that the job market is continuing to show in a positive light. Unemployment rates continue to be a bit low, but the real question is, are the jobs in the areas that will allow the American people to be able to afford the cost of living in the U.S.? And so those are continue to be challenges. Gas prices have a bit stabilized. We know that the president has gone into oil reserves to be able to ensure that gas prices could be reduced. But we also know that that the world has warned President Biden against that. And so will that have an adverse effect over the next months and years to come by us going into those oil reserves to be able to stabilize the gas prices here? And so as you look at the day-to-day operations, I think that many Americans, obviously we're in the fourth quarter here in the U.S., and financially we are typically, this is a buying time, and we are seeing retail sales continuing to be a little bit better than expected, but will they really be where they need to be in order to show that the U.S. economy is strong right now? I think that we're going to be looking at a first quarter that is going to really be a kind of a temperature gauge. Will we continue to see interest rates increase? And so the day-to-day life for an American, I think, is still one that is struggling through being able to afford everyday groceries and prices. We all know we just avoided a major railway shutdown, which would have meant a major stop in transport of goods throughout the country. So there's a lot of work that I think the president is still trying to do to ensure that the life for every American is one that they feel comfortable about and also meets the needs of the middle class.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Maria. It's less than 2 weeks to Christmas, so if I don't see you before then, we don't get to talk compliments of the season. But if we do, you can bet I'll be bringing up Christmas in the U.S. at that time. Thank you for now.
Thank you, too.
And still to come on the program, a volunteer plays piano inside destroyed church in Ukraine's Bakhmut region. Please stay on with us. Welcome back. In the sports, the International Boxing Association has lifted its suspension of the Boxing Federation of Ukraine and recognized the leadership of Kirilo Shevchenko. Mr. Shevchenko, who had previously been listed by Ukraine's Ministry of Justice as someone with the right to execute the governing body's legal acts, beat current IBA Vice President Vladimir Protivus in an election at the FBU Congress. Two separate boards of directors had been battling for leadership, but Mr. Shevchenko's panel has taken control and is now recognized by the IBA. The IBA had cited government interference as the reason for enforcing the suspension in September, but had legal representation present at an FVU meeting and concluded that the presidency of Mr. Shevchenko was legitimate. Mr. Protivus had held the FVU presidency since the year 2008. And Ukraine's Youth and Sports Minister and National Olympic Committee President Vadim Gutset has underlined his opposition to Russian and Belarusian participation in international sports. Russia and Belarus have largely been frozen out of international sports since the invasion of Ukraine in February, with the International Olympic Committee recommending the exclusion of their athletes and officials from competition. At the Olympic Summit, a decision was made to agree to follow up on Olympic Council of Asia proposal to enable Russian and Belarusian athletes take part in its competitions. But Mr. Gutset insisted that until the war in Ukraine ends, they cannot meet at international competitions with Russians and Belarusians. Mr. Macron, that's the French president, had suggested before then that sports should not be politicized and that athletes from all countries, sometimes including countries at war, should be permitted to compete at major events, including the Paris 2024 Olympics and Paralympics. And finally on the program, in a show to boost morale in war-torn areas, this video shows a volunteer playing the piano inside a destroyed church in Bakhmut in Ukraine's Donetsk region. The pianist's brother says the siblings are volunteers who travel to areas impacted by the war So far, he said, they have donated over 20 sleeping bags for the military, as well as over 100 gifts for children. Pictures online from inside the Church of Our Lady of the Holy Rosary in Bakhmut match the video posted online showing the same fresco paintings and the piano. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has said that the situation in key areas of the Donbas front in eastern Ukraine remains very difficult, but Kiev's forces are repelling Russian attacks and inflicting significant losses. Mr. Zelensky also said Russian forces had destroyed the town of Bakhmut, one of the epicenters of recent fighting, where this pianist is plying his trade. Some joy in the middle of desperate despair. Thanks for being with us. My name is Ladi Akere-Doluale. That's the show this Monday morning. There's more throughout the day on all our stories, most especially on The World Today at 5. Do watch out for that. But for now, have yourselves a wonderful day and week ahead. Good morning.